The morning sun rose slowly, spreading a warm glow across the clearing. Sarah tightened her grip on the heavy log and heaved it into place with a quiet grunt. The wood felt rough against her hands, and the sting of the grain didn't bother her. Any more sweat lined her forehead as she wiped it away with the back of her hand, brushing a stray strand of hair from her tired but determined face. This was her land now, and every piece she laid felt like a piece of herself finding its place in the wilderness. At the edge of the clearing, a lone rider watched from atop his horse. Mark didn't move, didn't speak, he just watched. The woman worked with a strength and purpose that spoke to something deep inside him. He felt a faint ache in his chest, an ache he hadn't felt in years. This tiny, hard-working figure framed by the rising sun sparked a warmth long buried by grief. Somehow, in the silence, with only the sound of hammer and wood, a quiet thought surfaced in him. Maybe life could still be built from broken pieces. Maybe for both of them. Mark sat a little straighter in the saddle, brushing dust from the brim of his hat as he watched the woman drive a long iron spike deep into the timber. There was a strength in her that spoke louder than words, a quiet resilience he hadn't witnessed in a long time. He remembered a time when he too had worked with hands like that, shaping a place where laughter would fill the walls. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. With a slow breath, he swung down from his horse and led it closer, stopping a respectful distance away. The sound of hooves snapping twigs announced his presence, and when she glanced up, brushing hair and sawdust from her forehead, their eyes met. He tipped his hat, voice deep and cautious. "Looks like you've got a fine start here." "Ma'am?" he said, brushing the trail dust from his shirt. She didn't answer right away, wary of strangers, but didn't turn away either. The silence felt long, yet not unfriendly. Mark offered a shy smile and a nod towards the half-finished wall. "If you're open to an extra hand, I wouldn't mind helping you raise the next beam." For a moment, she considered him a tall figure with strong hands and lines of sorrow. Across his sun-worn face, slowly she gave a quiet nod, brushing her palm down the leg of her worn jeans. "Help is hard to come by out here," she said quietly, voice soft but sure. "If you're offering, I won't say no." He smiled faintly, looping the reins of his horse over a low branch, and stepped closer. As he shrugged out of his jacket and set to work beside her, it felt as if some long-closed door in both their hearts had just begun to creak open. The afternoon sun was beating down when Mark stepped closer, brushing the sawdust from his hands. Together, he and Sarah tightened the ropes around the long beam and pulled it upright, muscles straining until it settled into place with a solid, satisfying thud. They worked in a quiet rhythm, a word exchanged here and there. "Hold this," a bit higher, "that's it," until, piece by piece, the frame of the little cabin began to rise. Sarah watched Mark out of the corner of her eye, wary yet quietly grateful for the help. The man worked with practiced hands, his voice deep and slow when he spoke, a voice that felt rooted in the earth. Occasionally, when she glanced up to wipe the sweat from her brow, she caught a hint of something in his gaze, a hint of old grief mixed with faint, hopeful warmth. They stopped only when the sun sank low, painting the trees in amber and crimson. The skeleton of a cabin stood between them now, a symbol of possibility. Sarah sank down on a log, brushing the dust from her arms, and offered Mark a shy smile. "I wouldn't have gotten this far today if you hadn't come by." He tilted his hat back, brushing a hand across the stubble of his jaw, and smiled quietly. "A man needs a reason to work," he said softly, looking at the rising walls, "and it feels like this place has a heart worth working for." Sarah met his gaze, brushing a strand of hair from her own dusty cheek. In that moment, surrounded by freshly cut wood and the deepening twilight, a quiet understanding passed between them, an understanding that somehow, building a home together, could be the first step towards finding belonging for them both. As dusk deepened, the air cooled, and Sarah waved Mark toward the little campfire she had built earlier. The crackle of the flames was a welcome sound, filling the silence between them. She pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle from a pack and offered it shyly, a piece of cornbread she had baked that morning. Mark accepted it with a nod of thanks, brushing the dust from his hands before breaking it in half and sharing it with her. They sank down on rough logs, the warmth of the fire chasing away the evening's chill. Slowly, words began to tumble forth. Mark spoke first, brushing a hand across the brim of his hat as he confessed in a low voice, "I had a wife once." and a boy. We built a place like this long ago, thought it would be ours forever. The ache in his voice was unmistakable, and when he fell silent, the sound of the wind brushing through the trees was the only reply. Sarah drew a slow breath, brushing a piece of bark from her skirt, and offered her own quiet truth. I came out here after everyone I had was gone. The city felt too crowded for loneliness, so I came to the wilderness to build something that was mine, something I could call a home. For a moment, the crackle of the flames was the only sound. Mark looked across the fire at her, seeing more than a strong, capable woman building a cabin. He saw the heart that refused to give up. Slowly he offered a nod, voice soft but certain. Maybe building doesn't just make walls stand tall. Maybe it can put the pieces of a heart back together too. Sarah met his gaze, brushing hair from her weather-worn face, and smiled shyly. The warmth between them felt as solid and hopeful as the logs rising behind them, a quiet promise in the making. The ring shifted suddenly, bringing with it the faint, sharp smell of rain. Dark, heavy clouds rolled across the horizon, swallowing the stars and blotting out the glow of the waning sunset. Mark rose quickly, brushing the last crumbs of cornbread from his hands. "Looks like a storm's coming," he said, reaching for a tarp dot. Sarah was already on her feet, grabbing a length of rope and a hammer. Together, with wordless precision, they pulled a canvas tarp tight between the rising walls of the cabin and a nearby tree. The first drops fell as they tightened the ropes, a soft patter that quickly turned into a drumming downpour. They ducked under the makeshift shelter just as the wind surged, hauling the tarp tight until it snapped like a whip, huddled together. Knees brushing, they watched the lightning dance across the darkened hills. The rain was a curtain of sound, and for a moment the world felt narrowed down to the space between them. Mark shrugged out of his coat and placed it around Sarah's shoulders, brushing the raindrops from her tangled hair as she looked up at him. The warmth of that simple gesture sank deep, deeper than words. In that moment, surrounded by the crash of the storm, Mark felt the weight of loss shift slightly, replaced by the faint hum of belonging. Sarah pulled the coat closer, brushing the damp hair from her forehead, and offered him a shy, grateful smile. Somehow, under that canvas and the dark, stormy skies, a quiet understanding settled between them that even after all the broken pieces, a new chapter could be built. Not just with hands, but with hearts willing to try again. With the storm past and the mist rising from the woods, morning came crisp and fresh. The sun spilled over the clearing, gilding the rising walls of the cabin, and Mark felt a quiet sense of belonging take root deep in his chest. As he worked that morning, he found himself carving a piece of wood with a slow, meticulous hand. At first, it was just to have something to do between hauling beams and setting planks, but soon the shape emerged, a tiny, rounded cradle that fit in the palm of his hand. Sarah noticed as she passed by, brushing the wood shavings from a stack of freshly hewn planks. She stopped, leaning closer, brushing a strand of hair from her dusty forehead. "That's beautiful work," she said, softly, brushing a finger across the tiny lines he had carved. Mark shrugged, brushing the sawdust from the surface, voice low and shy. "Just something to remember the boy I lost long ago," he confessed quietly. "But maybe one day it could be more than a remembrance." He glanced up at her, voice wavering slightly. "Maybe this place we're building can hold new memories, too." Sarah stood very still, brushing the tiny wooden cradle with her fingers as the morning sun winked between the trees. Slowly, she smiled, a hopeful, shy smile, and for the first time felt the warmth of belonging stir within her. In that quiet moment, with a tiny wooden cradle resting between them, both felt it deep in their hearts. This was more than a cabin rising from the earth. This was a chance to build something new, a home where broken hearts could find belonging and, perhaps one day, the sound of new beginnings. The afternoon sun bathed the clearing in a golden glow as the final log was lifted into place. Mark and Sarah stepped back, brushing the sawdust from their hands, and stood side by side. The cabin rose before them, strong, proud, and solid. Its freshly hewn walls shimmered faintly in the warm light, and the roofline promised shelter, belonging, and a future. Sarah placed a hand against the rough wood, brushing it as if to test its strength, and felt the sting of emotion rise in her chest. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, voice wavering as she glanced at Mark. smiled and pulled off his hat, brushing it across his thigh before looking down at her. A place doesn't have to be fancy to be a home.